Welcome, everyone, to the C-Suite Marketing Perspectives podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host. We've got a very rare opportunity today to really delve into and get some insights from Jake Brawley. Jake, you are the current CRO at an AI technology company, Krisp, meeting AI technology. I know that's underselling it. You came in as the CMO and you transitioned to the CRO. And that's a big part of what we want to talk about here today is there's a trend that's happening here to the transition from CMOs to CROs. And what I'd love to do within that discussion, what makes a good transition like that, but also from the perspective of a CRO to all other CMOs that are watching right now, what does a B2B CRO want from their CMO? Maybe just start us out with a bit more about your background.
First of all, thanks for having me on, Steve. I always love to have this discussion. It's been a big part of my career, thinking about the alignment of all of the customer-facing functions and the go-to-market. So the topic is something I'm very passionate about. But I think relevant to this discussion is understanding a little bit of my background. For the last 20 years, I've spent the majority of my career in technology go-to-market, B2B primarily, but also B2C and channel as well. And the majority of my early career was spent in product marketing. And in fact, one of my first roles at Microsoft as a product marketer owning the Windows desktop business, which might seem pretty straightforward, but actually that's a big business and it's fairly complex in terms of all of the different customer segments, the channels and routes to market, and how to manage that business as a product marketing perspective. But most importantly, what that taught me in the way that Microsoft defined product marketing and the subsequent roles that I had in product marketing is at the end of the day, your real job is to drive revenue and specifically to drive the product line revenue that you're responsible for. But very early in my career, that was the mentality that I had, which was whatever it takes to grow the revenue for the product line business is what is required from the role. Now, sometimes sales decks, the differentiated messaging and positioning, pricing and packaging, those things, all of those are definitely levers to do that. But more broadly, you are thinking about all of the functions that I guess a traditional CMO would own, as well as the things that head of sales or CRO, CSO in some cases would own as well. Just to summarize, in some ways, I don't see much of a distinction between these roles because at the end of the day, they should all be pointed at revenue growth.
One of the big differences is that you now oversee the team. So you oversee marketing, you oversee customer support and success, you oversee sales. Maybe give us a little bit of an opportunity to look inside behind the curtain there, because one might think that, all right, since they all report to you, there's one revenue team. The ideas of silos and misalignment and things like that should just magically vanish and disappear. Tell me a little bit about how you think about it.
So going back to product marketing, where it's defined in the way that I find it, and most of my experience, you're responsible and accountable for all of those functions because they all accrue to driving the product line revenue. The big difference is you don't own those functions. And that's a big distinction. From my standpoint, it makes a lot of things easier that I do now have ownership of those functions. In some ways, the accountability hasn't changed much from what I've experienced in product marketing, but I didn't own them. But to your point, the alignment piece, the alignment problem doesn't necessarily go away. And this would be true, by the way, for any team, large or small. When you have different managers that have different functional ownership, whether it's product and engineering, whether it's only marketing, whether it's revenue, you still need to make sure that you're driving as the single leader for those functions, you're driving alignment across those teams. And so the alignment problem doesn't go away. It becomes easier in some ways, but it's still very important to make sure that your success team, your marketing team, your sales team, your inside sales, revenue operations and enablement, that there is this shared vision and shared ownership of common goals. And that being revenue and growth, everybody has to, at the end of the day, be accountable and responsible for that. But the contributions to that across teams is where some of the things become different. And so that's not a siloed problem at that point because you're doing those things with the understanding that they're going to accrue the goals that we all have, which is revenue growth.
If you could just give us some insights in terms of, it's one thing to maybe co-create, publish goals, say we're all revenue driven, but then in actuality to make it happen.
Part of the reason I love this job, by the way, is because it's so dynamic. It requires an understanding of the unique elements of the product, the value prop, the offering, who the buyer persona is, who the user persona is, what the competitive dynamic in and around the space looks like, the changing market dynamic. And then along with that, there's a bunch of different levers that you can choose to pull to make a successful go to market. And that's a lot of the fun of any revenue role. But like you said, there's a lot of different ways to make that happen. So we just got done with our sales kickoff, and smaller sales kickoff because we're an early company. We're about 150, 200 employees, but we still have all of the same challenges with alignment that I've had at very large organizations as well. And as I said before, while we all share the revenue goal, success and support are thinking very hard about user adoption. And that makes sense, right? If you want to call it a siloed CX organization would be thinking about that. But the difference is in adoption and the limited resources you have to drive adoption, you want to point those resources at the highest potential return on revenue. And so right away, that overarching revenue goal becomes important because it means adoption isn't done blindly. It's actually done very specifically and targeted at the highest propensity accounts, meaning the accounts with the highest potential lifetime value or revenue upside or white space, however you want to think about it. And that's a very different than organizations that have these functions as siloed, where that alignment doesn't always happen that way. There's certainly a focus on adoption, but it isn't necessarily overlapped with the rest of the revenue teams in terms of where those resources are best spent. We have a short list of accounts that we call our customer named accounts, and those are the accounts that across the team we're focused on. I'll talk more about this in a minute because this is actually the key to alignment, but I'll pause there too because that's a kind of a big concept.
One of the most important things I think you were talking about the entire go-to-market strategy that doesn't end with a sale, right? And it goes into customer adoption, customer loyalty, upsell, cross-sell. So you just mentioned overlap. That's an interesting statement you just made there, because this isn't like a baton race where you pass off to the next team. There is an overlap, and there's a way that we continually support each other. I just wanted to ask you the question because that idea of overlapping, something that necessarily is endemic across the industry.
It is. Yeah. I personally have never seen a head of sales or head of marketing that are really trying to figure out how they align with one another. I do think that there is, in some cases, unhealthy, in some cases, healthy friction or tension to align to common objectives, not to align with each other. And what that means, and by the way, the easiest way in my experience to do that is to not align the functions, but to have the functions align to the customer and to the market and to the buyer, not with each other. And once that becomes the common framework of alignment, it very naturally creates alignment across these different teams and different functions. It sounds very simple and very easy, but I've seen this in various states of disarray, and it's helped me learn what not to do, but importantly also what to do, which is to really start with your target. I'm talking about as a team, which accounts do, again, have the highest ICP, have the right profile, that we would prioritize our limited resources because we know and believe that those will have the best return, whether it be conversion or cross-sell, upsell. It sounds easy, but I've often seen a lot of misalignment between just answering that question. Who are our target buyers? The confusion between a buyer persona and a user persona, which are very different things.
What you're talking about here, if we put it in book definition, we don't spend enough time thinking about like net reoccurring revenue. And a huge part of revenue expansion and growth in a company has to come within. We have to identify who's the biggest priorities. We have to have targets. We have to have goals. We have to have internal campaigns. We have to treat them as we do, really, this whole quest for new logos. That tends to get 98% of our time and effort, right?
Yeah. Other thing I've learned in my career, there's no copy paste playbook. You're leveraging a lot of things you've learned, but you will never be able to successfully take something that worked somewhere and replicate it somewhere else because there's so many different variables that have to be considered. Now, I've managed start to scale. I've also managed the Windows business. At that time was a $1.5 billion business that I, as a product marketer, was responsible for. And so the orders of magnitude are very different. And in addition to the dynamics of the market, the product, all these things changing, another one, especially for early stage companies, are all of these milestones of growth that you go from early stage, maybe stealth, getting to a product market fit, then getting to what I would call like the go-to-market fit so that you could have high confidence in a repeatable commercial model that can be invested in at scale. And along that journey, early on, it is very much focused on new logo acquisition. You're trying to figure out like who are the people that are going to buy our product. And that's a big focus, right? And that focus, to your point, especially for recurring and subscription revenue, starts to change pretty quickly because the more customers you start to add, the better job you do with retaining those customers and growing them very quickly. And it's much less expensive to keep and grow a customer than it is to acquire a customer. So there's that piece. But if you're successful, you get to a pretty quick inflection point where suddenly the majority of your revenue is coming from existing customers and not your net new logos. So it does depend on, I think, where you're at, your milestone journey with a new product go to market for an existing company or a new company with a new offering altogether. That does have a big bearing on where you apply resources as it relates to what you're talking about, which is new logo versus your existing customer base.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've all seen the write-ups. We've all had conversations with our peers and everything about an environment where most companies are still constricting their budgets. So budgets are shrinking. And I interviewed over 80 CMOs last year. Not once did I had a conversation that said, you know what? We're putting more focus and more emphasis on our existing customers.
You're hearing it now because that's a big focus on our sales kickoff. Obviously, you're doing strategic account planning, but a pretty big initiative for us this next year is what we're thinking about as our customer named account playbook. And what that looked like in real planning terms is that you have an account manager AE who's kind of your quarterback coordinator of the account, but working across the rest of our revenue teams as really important parts of that account team. SDRs that are prospecting into those accounts in coordination with the AE or AEM. Field marketing so that we know what kind of tactics or resources should we be deploying in an account-based way for that specific customer named account. And success and adoption, which has to be a part of that plan. Those were the breakouts that we actually had in account planning. And this is we're a Series A company, so we're fairly early. That was a first of kind collaboration, Krisp, and bringing those kind of account squads together for true account planning. But the big focus is our existing customer base for all of the reasons you just said.
I'm going to take a slight left turn here and ask you, because it's the title of the episode here, what do B2B CROs want from their CROs with the context of what we've just talked about in the background here? And then I'm going to flip and ask you the question, because you play both roles, what do B2B CMOs want from their CROs?
Yeah. This is interesting to me because there's also varying definitions about what those roles are. In some cases, a CRO, or you've seen equivalent titles like head of field operations and other things like that, do not own the marketing function. In some cases, they do. In my case, there isn't a CMO at this point, right? I was the CMO and now I'm the CRO, but I own the marketing function. And so I think your question, I'll just say it's the head of marketing and the head of sales, just to maybe oversimplify, but it goes back to the sales and marketing alignment. And it's an age old question. What does sales want from marketing? What does marketing want from sales? I'll just take it that way. And I can tell you this, I've never seen a head of sales that doesn't want more revenue, and marketing contribution and support in that is quality pipeline that can be converted. At the end of the day, that's just a simplified view of it. But sales is operating on a quarter to quarter timeframe. They're very quota driven. Now, the balance and the tricky part for the head of marketing is that not all of marketing budget in most cases should be spent on near-term revenue impact, lead generation, demand generation. If you're really looking at a healthy long-term business, you should be thinking about things that don't maybe have return in the next quarter or the next year, but over time will have a positive return, like awareness, like air cover. And that's much harder to quantify and measure. And so you often get that tension where sales is saying, why are we spending on this billboard or this air cover? It doesn't do anything for me. Now, what they may or may not know is that 2 years ago, that investment was made and they're now benefiting from deals in the pipeline because that awareness and that continued nurturing is the thing that's kept the brand in front of a potential prospect. And now they're ready. And that does make a pretty material difference. So you can't overlook that. But at the end of the day, never heard a head of sales say that they didn't want quality pipeline for marketing. And then there's a lot of different conversations about whether or not that pipeline is quality or not. And then that becomes the conversation of, is it because of the quality of the leads or is it because of our ability to convert or not convert those. And that becomes a sales issue. That's where you get tension and the friction between head of marketing and head of sales. So I don't know if that's answers your question in one direction. I can look at it in the other direction. And what would a head of marketing want from head of sales?
I wanted to get your point of view on two things. And these are things that were shared of the interviews that I did this last year. There's a woman, Jamie Geyer. She actually lives in Redmond. She's a 3-time B2B CMO. She put it to me this way, and I had never thought about it this succinctly. She said, today's brand is tomorrow's demand.
That's a great way to summarize it.
Isn't that?
That's exactly right.
She said, it also impacts sales in tremendous ways. As a sales organization in the B2B world, we're experts, we're trusted advisors. So the stature of the brand and positioning with trust and authority, our trusted advisor status as a brand, she said, takes sales cycles away from the beginning of the sales process.
Yes, it absolutely does. You think about it, right? If you're, and I'll use Krisp as an example. We pioneered software-based noise cancellation with early AI, before AI was cool, right? And we've since added a lot of new capabilities, but I might be at a trade show and I might come by Krisp booth and really not have much mind share around that problem. But hey, I saw them there 2 years ago. I saw them again a year ago. I know what they do. I knew who they are. Of course, now I've maybe taken a new role where maybe noise in my call center is a major problem. Wait a minute. I think I heard of this company. That latent demand or that investment in the brand equity and awareness is certainly important over time. It's just very difficult to quantify that because there's no really good way to measure the scenario that I just walked through. But it does happen quite a bit if you're doing today's brand is tomorrow's demand.
So this is a gentleman, 2-time B2B CMO, is now a 2-time B2B CEO. When I asked him in an interview, what do B2B CEOs want from their CMOs? He says, very simple. I want them to add value to my company.
Right. Which translated at the end of the day, I'll just go back and say it again, revenue growth, especially for early stage. And because that's what the CEO wants, that's what the investors want, right? And if you're a public company, that's what your shareholders want. And if the new variable is obviously doing that in a disciplined way. Before it was just growth at all costs, but I don't think it's changed. It's really, at the end of the day, it's revenue growth. And as you're saying, like whether it's the CEO or the head of sales, marketing's contribution must be tied to that revenue growth.
Absolutely.
Whether it's near term or long term. And so that becomes the issue. But I think where marketing runs into problems or where they even fail, and certainly not going to make the bridge from a CMO to a CRO, if that's the trajectory, is where it's unclear what the marketing contribution to revenue is. And I have seen that in my past quite a bit. Head of marketing are focused on pipeline as their primary objective. They're focused on maybe MQLs and myopically. And without that in game being revenue growth and tying your investments and contributions to it, I think most are going to find themselves in trouble.
A couple of months ago, I did a meme and it was a CMO talking with another person in the company. And he says, I don't know what sales alignment. You know how many MQLs I've thrown over the wall? Because every CMO, we've all had driven into our heads, right? We have to be pipeline revenue focused. We have to have a tech stack that allows us to quantify marketing attribution. What are you on? You're in charge of marketing. You're in charge of sales. What kind of direct link attribution do you want to see?
Yeah. So I've talked a lot about revenue growth, and certainly that's paramount, but the three big objectives across my go-to-market and across all of the revenue teams, sales, as I've said, in order to get sales, you have to have pipeline and you have to have pipeline coverage. You have to have quality pipeline. Sales, the adage will say pipeline is lifeline. That's very true. And the last one is adoption, because it turns out adoption is closely linked to whether a customer is going to not only renew, which is baseline, but more importantly, expand by more licenses, by additional products. Across the team, those are really the big three. I probably put them in the wrong order, but pipeline, sales, adoption, if you want to think about it in terms of the funnel or the bow tie. Going back to our question around alignment, that's an internal alignment thing. But the real way to get the teams aligned is to make sure that going to the customer and the targets, the objectives, it has to be outside in. It has to start with a shared understanding of who you're going after.
What that does is that just shows most marketing and sales teams stop at the sale. They don't think about post-sale. And you've just very eloquently tied why measuring and focusing on that adoption process is directly related to revenue, which every marketing and salesperson will raise their hand and say, that's my goal. So you've just defined a big area of responsibility for those two teams that they really don't have on their checklist.
Yes. The helpful part about a single owner for these functions is that I don't have to go explain what an ICP is to somebody. I've got this knowledge sitting in one place, and that is helpful. But I have seen a lot of go to market teams that are structured in quote unquote silos where it's not only we're not on the same page with some of these things, but there's not a shared understanding of some of these different areas of the business. There's a lack of understanding of the different functions. And that also raises its own challenges. Part of it is some of that education. And the good news is, I'll call it the collapsing of the funnel. But I think what I've observed over the last certainly 5 years, but through the course of career, is that as software in particular and tech has moved to subscription and this life cycle of adoption, renewal, advocacy has become more compressed and tighter, that these functions are blurring of the lines between the functions is more prominent. It's not as siloed as it used to be. And that's purely because it can't be. It's like you said, things don't stop once you sign the contract and you got a new logo. I think that's been a really good thing, but it's part of the reason why you're seeing heads of marketing take on CRO. And you're seeing things like they used to be in silos, like marketing operations and sales operations become a shared function, and revenue operations versus having those as siloed functions. So I do think we're evolving what traditionally has been a much more disjointed go-to-market.
I've got a question that we haven't covered yet, and that is, in today's world, the B2B buyer is going much more to the self-serve. And it's a big trend that is growing. And so they're waiting longer and longer to talk to us. They're consuming more content to make their decisions on their own before they want to bring us into the picture. So that means that the contribution of marketing is becoming more important to get that quality conversation, that quality pipeline created. So if you go back to the very beginning, here's my question for you. On a scale of 1 to 10, if you had to rate the importance of content into the overall growth and sustainability of the company, 1, not important at all. 10, it's vital to the overall growth of the company. How would you rate it?
That's a really good question. Prior to Krisp, I worked for a company called HighSpot, and HighSpot is a sales enablement platform that addresses a really historically big problem, which is quote unquote content being disjointed everywhere. And what then happens is I, as a seller, store my content locally, it's off brand, off message, and all of those things. But having worked for HighSpot, this term content I've learned is a loaded term in itself. You have to answer the question, what do you mean by content? Because content could be a white paper or a one pager or a video, as an example, be a seller that's asking you discovery questions.
Let me frame it a little bit differently. So over the years, all the companies that I've worked with, I feel especially tech companies, but almost every B2B company, they were really good about talking about their own babies. If you looked at the size of all the content being created, overwhelmingly, it was product-focused content, which is incredibly important. But reframe the conversation this way. If our goal today in the self-serve B2B buyer trend is to get earlier in the conversation, that doesn't come with product marketing. That comes with us as trusted advisors in the industry, helping them solve the problems, succeed at their jobs, right? Be that expert. And so I guess you could call it thought leadership.
I'll go back to where I started, right? I disagree. That's not product marketing. I think where product marketing gets defined narrowly, sure, that's lower funnel content, sales specific content. But in my experience, product marketing does not stop there. It also means you're very much thinking about the air cover, the advertising, what's that top of funnel message is, because nobody buys software to buy software. Nobody. Software is purchased because it enables somebody to either solve a problem or do something that they couldn't otherwise do as efficient. And we do, especially product marketing, get into the trap of talking far too much about the product and the offering versus what it's solving for the people you want to talk to. So you said thought leadership, but I'll just call it anything that's less connected to the product and more connected to the outcome and the problem that somebody's wants to solve. Because let's assume nobody knows Krisp. Nobody's going to be searching Google for Krisp. Now, what they are going to be searching for is how to reduce noise complaints in my call center. And that's a very common trap for a lot of product marketing, but it's also a common trap for the entire go-to-market, is that you're spending too much time and resources. Like you said, it's important, but it's not the only thing that you have to think about if you're thinking about full funnel. Absolutely. This is also true for brand is not, and from my perspective, something that is a marketing accountability, because brand is anything, it's the way that a prospect or customer experiences your company. And that experience comes not only through marketing channels and visual identity and design, I would argue in some cases, even more importantly, it comes through, oh, here are the emails and the outreach that I get from this SDR who's trying to ping me on LinkedIn. Okay, I'm observing what that looks like and feels like in this company. And now I've set up a call with the AE. And that experience with the AE is also giving me an experience with that company. And it turns out, and by the way, I didn't even mention product is also an obvious touch point, and the brand experience has to uphold across all of those because it can be the difference maker between a good sales experience and a bad sales experience in terms of what vendor I as a buyer choose to go with. And it has nothing to do with visual identity, but again, I'll say quote unquote brand experience I got in my interactions with the AE, equally important. And thinking about all of those, not only as a revenue leader, but as a marketing leader, as channels to the market, which a lot of marketing leaders don't necessarily think about your SDR as a channel, your AE as a channel, your success reps as a channel, your product as a channel. And those are really important to have a real good brand experience, differentiated brand experience.
Those are experiences that are front and center when they're in their decision-making process. So it's hugely important. I love thinking about that. Nobody's ever said that to me.
The way that we show up at an event in our booth and the interactions we have there, those are people that don't know a thing about us. Hey, tell me about Krisp. What is this? And so it really is, I'll just go back to any interaction, wherever it's coming from, is accrues to your brand, either positively or negatively. And going back to the aligned go-to-market, that's not a CMO owned thing. It might be an owned thing, but it's really something to be effective that everybody has a part in across the go-to-market.
I have a feeling we could talk for hours here. If there was one takeaway you wanted the C-suite folks that are watching this to remember from this conversation, what would it be?
I'll just go back to the alignment from my standpoint starts outside in. And if you're finding yourself focused too much on alignment and friction internally, I would just encourage you to look outside at who are we trying to engage with? Do we have a shared understanding? Do we have shared definitions? And start there because that is the best way to drive quote unquote alignment, whether these functions report to the same person or in different parts of the organization. I think it applies universally. So that would be the one thing that I would advise on the C-suite when you're thinking about this alignment issue.
Jake, thank you so much for coming on and sharing. If people wanted to reach out and ask you a question, would providing them maybe a link to your profile on LinkedIn the best way to do it?
You can find me, jake@krisp.ai. You can email me. And I'm pretty responsive. So I would love to connect with any of you. And I really appreciate it again, you having me on, Steve.
Thank you. This was a fantastic conversation. And I know that there's a lot of notes that have been taken, that's for sure.